The implementation of the UNDRIP Act of 2021 is actually a vital topic. And I just want to remind ourselves always that UNDRIP was a remarkable international achievement, quite frankly, one that I did not expect to see would work. It was a real accomplishment by the Indigenous folks who put it together. UNDRIP documents the shared hardships, injustices, mistreatments, and the sorrows of Indigenous peoples around the world. And it covered a whole variety of Indigenous groups, cultural encounters, and historical and legal settings. In the early years after the passage to the United Nations, UNDRIP was described as, in quotation marks, an aspirational document outlining what Indigenous people deserved from their national governments, and what national governments and the UNDRIP and the United Nations together felt was actually owed to them. UNDRIP was not crafted as a definitive and detailed legislative program. It was not designed to respond to any particular national or regional context. It was designed as sort of a general statement of principles and values. What it did was it called the world to do much better, a lot better than what it had been doing with the treatment of Indigenous people, starting with the respecting Indigenous and treaty rights, but going far beyond that in the areas of equity and social justice. As a non-Aboriginal person, I come at it very differently from Indigenous scholars. I've actually been really troubled by how UNDRIP has unfolded to this point. The response in Canada to UNDRIP has been mixed at best. Most non-Aboriginal people, most non-Indigenous people in Canada ignore it. Or if they have paid much attention to it, they see it as a very vague roadmap toward better relationships, not as sort of a definitive, a detailed plan. In my experience when talking to Indigenous, particularly at the community level, they're much more familiar with UNDRIP than non-Indigenous peoples are. They know about the Implementation Act. But I think I would also say, in my experience, that few of them look at this current process with either excitement or hope. They see it as another part of a process that Canada has gone through over many years. So just as a way of sort of framing my conversation and my contribution today, permit me to make 4 different observations about UNDRIP and the Canadian implementation process, more general, I think, than perhaps others might. Starting with this, the history of Indigenous government relations in Canada is one of broken promises and the failure to honor commitments. You can see this from the peace and friendship treaties in the Maritimes in the 18th century, goes through the Royal Proclamation also in the 18th century, to the historic treaties starting in Ontario, going across Western and Northern Canada. UNDRIP and UNDRIP implementation has the potential to be another example of heightened expectation and broken promises. And I really urge the Senate and Parliament to make sure that it's truly committed to the shared completion of the process. To agree with Dr. Gunn's observation about making it a shared process, but to complete the process and to actually honor the promises. Don't go down the path unless you're prepared to finish the exercise, because quite frankly, we've seen that happen too many times before. UNDRIP describes the abuses and excesses of colonial powers and nation states regarding Indigenous peoples. It outlines, in my mind, the minimal steps necessary to address the damage. The damage is huge and some places permanent. But no one has actually put a cost to this. I read through the implementation plan again today in quite some detail, and every line spoke to me of tens of millions of dollars, every single line. And I wonder if people have actually put a cost to this. Is it possible to fund UNDRIP? I don't say this to say we shouldn't do it. I say we have to say this because I want us to do it right. Is UNDRIP and the Implementation Act politically saleable? I'll use one example. I personally have grave concerns about the rapid decline and continuing decline in Indigenous language use across this country. Take a look at the UNDRIP provisions on education and services and the implementation part of that. It will cost quite literally billions of dollars to do this properly. Urgently needed. We should have done this 50 years ago. Should never have had to do it in the first instance. Our present efforts in language retention and language strengthening are tiny in comparison to the actual need. Thirdly, implementation is a process and not a destination. It's not clear to me that the Canadian public has a clear vision, certainly not one that's shared with Aboriginal peoples, of the desired outcomes. In other words, we've started down a path, but we don't know where we're going. Real autonomy, political re-empowerment, prosperity sharing, cultural revitalization are essential if Canada is to honor the UNDRIP agreement. Evidence of general Canadian support for these outcomes is scarce. And in the past, and I see elements of this in the implementation plan, the goal is to tinker with programs and to make small changes rather than fundamental reordering of our government system. My fourth point, and you'll know this because you're working through this document very carefully, UNDRIP implementation is incredibly complicated and extremely difficult. The British Columbia's draft implementation plan and the initial steps that they've taken to implement UNDRIP show this to be true. Implementation cannot be constrained by artificial deadlines and must, in my view at least, be driven by Indigenous priorities, protocols, and timing, not be set by a legislative agenda or by a particular government's agenda. It will take decades to get this right. The Yukon signed its land claim deal in 1993. It has only implemented a small part of the overall modern treaty of 1993. This agreement will take decades to get right, recognizing that as things go slow, that the costs and consequences of going slow are borne disproportionately by Indigenous peoples. I think in sum that the implementation of UNDRIP done properly, and I truly want to see it done properly, would transform Canada in constructive and very positive ways. It's not simply a matter of changing a few policies and a few programs. It calls on our country to address historical injustices and to return the country to real partnership with Indigenous peoples. What I see is that First Nations, Inuit, and Métis are eager for such a reimagining of Canada. They deserve it. I'm not yet clear that the Canadian public is prepared for such a transformation. We have some places, the three Northern Territories, Northern Quebec, being decent examples, where the kind of transformation we desire is actually underway. But is the country as a whole ready for this transformation? Sadly, I think it's not. And I think a huge part of our job at this juncture, collectively, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, parliamentarians, academics, and others, is to actually do the work of getting Canada ready for UNDRIP in a positive and constructive way. We have a lot of work to get done before we actually get to the starting line, let alone get to the finishing line. So I thank you very much for your attention. I wish you all the best in your very important work.